Imagine a moment when a single potato could feed an entire family for a day. When creativity in the kitchen wasn't about gourmet ingredients, but about survival itself. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, American families faced unprecedented economic hardship. With unemployment rates soaring to 25% and food scarcity becoming a daily reality, our grandparents and great-grandparents invented dishes that would seem unthinkable today. These weren't recipes passed down through generations of culinary tradition. These were acts of desperation, ingenuity, and resilience. Today, we're traveling back to the dining tables of Depression-era America to explore 25 foods that once sustained millions but have now vanished from our modern tables. From bizarre sandwiches to creative uses of leftovers, each dish tells a story of a nation fighting to survive. We'll discover what people ate, why these foods disappeared, and what they reveal about human adaptability in the darkest of times. Let's begin this fascinating culinary journey through history. Food 1. Water pie. In 1932, as the Depression tightened its grip on America, housewives faced an impossible challenge. How do you make a pie without eggs, milk, or butter? The answer was water pie, a recipe that sounds more like a cruel joke than actual food. Water pie consisted of a basic pie crust filled with water, a few tablespoons of flour, sugar, butter substitute or lard, and vanilla extract if the family was lucky enough to afford it. The magic happened in the oven, where the ingredients somehow transformed into a custard-like filling. It wasn't creamy, it wasn't rich, but it was sweet and it filled empty stomachs. This dessert disappeared because it represented pure deprivation. As soon as families could afford real ingredients again after World War II, water pie was abandoned without nostalgia. Unlike other Depression foods that people remember fondly, water pie remained a symbol of poverty that nobody wanted to revisit. What's remarkable is that water pie actually worked from a chemical standpoint. The heat caused the small amount of fat to emulsify with the water and flour, creating a gel-like consistency that mimicked custard. It was accidental food science born from necessity. Water pie reminds us that dessert wasn't a luxury during the Depression, it was a psychological necessity. A small sweetness in bitter times. Food 2. Dandelion salad. Before the 1930s, dandelions were just weeds that homeowners tried to eliminate from their lawns. During the Depression, they became a free source of nutrition that could be found everywhere, from backyards to empty lots to roadsides across America. Dandelion salad typically consisted of young dandelion leaves, dressed with hot bacon grease if available, or simply vinegar and a pinch of salt. Some families added hard-boiled eggs when chickens were still laying. The bitter taste was strong, almost medicinal, but it was free nutrition growing abundantly everywhere, requiring nothing but the labor of picking. This practice faded rapidly after the Depression for several reasons. First, the rise of suburban lawns and widespread herbicide use made dandelions chemically unsafe to eat. Second, supermarkets became accessible and affordable, making foraged food seem primitive and unnecessary. Third, Americans developed a cultural aversion to eating weeds because it carried the unmistakable stigma of poverty. Ironically, dandelion greens are incredibly nutritious, containing more vitamin A than spinach, more calcium than broccoli, and substantial amounts of iron and potassium. Modern foraging movements have rediscovered them as a trendy superfood, but they'll never return to Depression-era prominence when they were a staple rather than a choice. Dandelion salad shows us how economic desperation can temporarily erase the line between weed and food, and how quickly we forget lessons of resourcefulness once prosperity returns. Food 3. Prune pudding. Prunes were everywhere during the Depression because they were cheap, didn't spoil quickly, packed well for shipping, and the government often included them in food assistance programs. But turning these wrinkled dried fruits into something families actually wanted to eat required creativity. Prune pudding mixed stewed prunes with breadcrumbs or stale bread, a little sugar if available, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. The mixture was baked until it formed a dense, dark, intensely sweet pudding that could be served as dessert or even breakfast. It was filling, provided energy, and made use of bread that was going stale. This dish vanished completely after the war because prunes developed an unfortunate reputation as old people food and became associated primarily with digestive health rather than culinary pleasure. The connection to poverty rations and the institutional feel of stewed prunes made them deeply unpopular with younger generations, who wanted to forget the hardship. Food marketers eventually tried to rebrand prunes as dried plums, in an attempt to escape the Depression-era stigma. but the damage was done. An entire generation associated prunes with scarcity and humiliation, feelings too powerful for even the sweetest pudding to overcome. Prune pudding taught us that some foods carry emotional baggage too heavy to overcome, no matter how nutritious or practical they might be. Food 4. Potato soup without milk. When dairy became too expensive for most families, potato soup had to adapt. This version eliminated milk entirely, relying on potatoes, water, onions if the family was fortunate, salt, and nothing else. It was poverty in a pot. The genius of this soup was that potato starch naturally thickened the broth as it cooked. Families would mash some of the potatoes directly into the liquid to create a creamier texture without any dairy. The result was pale, simple, and filling. It stuck to your ribs even if it didn't excite your taste buds. This soup disappeared the moment milk and cream became affordable again. The watery, pale appearance reminded people too much of deprivation and hunger. Modern potato soups are rich with heavy cream, butter, sharp cheddar cheese, crispy bacon, and fresh chives, everything Depression families couldn't afford and desperately wanted. The soup's simplicity was its strength during hard times. Anyone could make it with minimal ingredients, but that same simplicity became its weakness in times of prosperity. People wanted richness, indulgence, and abundance on their plates to prove they'd moved beyond survival. Potato soup without milk proves that texture and richness matter as much as flavor in our food memories, and that we eat with our emotions as much as our stomachs. Food 5. Peanut butter bread. This wasn't a peanut butter sandwich. It was actual yeast bread with peanut butter mixed directly into the dough before baking. It sounds strange to modern ears, but during the Depression, it was an ingenious way to add protein to the family's diet when meat was a rare luxury. Peanut butter was one of the cheapest protein sources available, costing just pennies per jar. Mixing it into bread dough stretched it even further while creating a dense, protein-rich loaf with a subtle nutty flavor. Families ate it plain, toasted, or with a thin spread of jam if they were lucky. This bread disappeared because it was dry, crumbly, and carried the unmistakable taste of making dough. Once meat became affordable again, protein-fortified bread seemed unnecessary and frankly unappetizing. The texture was nothing like the soft, fluffy white bread that became the American standard in the 1950s. Interestingly, peanut butter bread has seen minor revivals in health food and fitness circles where high-protein breads are valued. But it's marketed as a performance food, not a poverty food. The context completely changes its meaning and acceptability. This bread shows us how protein innovation emerges from necessity rather than choice, and how the same food can be shameful in one era and trendy in another. Food 6. Hoover stew, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the Depression. This stew was a one-pot meal containing whatever scraps were available, usually hot dogs or bologna, canned tomatoes, elbow macaroni, and maybe some wilted vegetables if you were lucky. Everything was thrown together in a single pot, cooked until soft and mushy, and served hot. There was no recipe, no technique, no culinary tradition, just desperation mixed with anger. The name itself was an insult, a way for hungry Americans to express their frustration with a president they felt had abandoned them. Hoover stew disappeared because it represented political resentment and failure as much as food. After the Depression ended and Franklin Roosevelt's policies brought relief, nobody wanted to remember Hoover or his namesake stew. The dish had no cultural identity beyond bitterness and blame. Modern one-pot meals are carefully crafted with complementary flavors and textures. They're celebrated as convenient and wholesome. Hoover stew was neither. It was survival food named as a curse, a culinary middle finger to failed leadership. Hoover stew reminds us that food can become a weapon of social criticism, and that the stories we tell about our meals matter as much as the ingredients themselves. Food 7. Milkweed pods. Milkweed grew wild across America in fields, along roadsides, and in abandoned lots. During the Depression, people who knew what to look for harvested the young seed pods to eat as vegetables, turning weeds into dinner at no cost. The pods were prepared by boiling them like green beans, often through multiple changes of water to remove the bitter, milky sap. When cooked properly, they had a texture similar to asparagus and a mild, slightly bitter flavor. Families served them with a little salt, butter if available, or vinegar. This practice ended because it was labor-intensive and carried real risks if the pods were picked too mature or prepared incorrectly. As supermarkets expanded and vegetables became affordable, the effort and danger of foraging milkweed no longer made sense. Additionally, eating foraged weeds carried an unmistakable poverty stigma. Today, milkweed is recognized as the crucial and exclusive food source for monarch butterfly caterpillars. Modern environmental consciousness makes eating milkweed seem almost unethical, like stealing from an endangered species. The cultural narrative has completely flipped from free food to protected ecosystem. Milkweed pods demonstrate how environmental awareness can replace food traditions and how our relationship with wild plants reflects our economic circumstances. Food 8. Mock apple pie. When fresh apples became too expensive for most families, resourceful housewives created an impossible substitute: mock apple pie made with Ritz crackers. It sounds absurd, but the chemistry actually worked, creating one of the Depression's most famous culinary deceptions. The crackers were soaked in a hot syrup made from water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice. As they absorbed the liquid, they softened and took on a texture remarkably similar to cooked apples. Baked in a pie crust with cinnamon, the result fooled many people. Nabisco was so proud of this innovation that they printed the recipe directly on their cracker boxes. This pie disappeared because it was fundamentally a trick, a culinary illusion that nobody needed once real apples became affordable again. Even though it tasted good, mock apple pie felt like settling for less, like admitting defeat. The emotional satisfaction of real fruit couldn't be replicated by crackers, no matter how clever the chemistry. The recipe survives today as a historical novelty and conversation piece, but never as a genuine choice. We make it to experience Depression-era ingenuity, not because we actually prefer it to real apple pie. Mock apple pie teaches us that food is about authenticity and truth as much as taste, and that we eat with our hearts and memories as much as our mouths. Food 9. Sugar sandwiches. This was perhaps the starkest symbol of Depression-era childhood. White bread spread with a thin layer of butter or margarine, then sprinkled with white sugar. Nothing more. It was what parents could offer when candy was an impossible luxury and fruit was too expensive. Children actually loved sugar sandwiches. The sweetness provided quick energy for play, and the crunchy texture where the sugar crystals hit the bread was satisfying. Parents gave these as treats after school, as dessert, or as a way to stop crying when there was nothing else to offer. This practice vanished completely because it represents pure empty calories, something modern nutritional consciousness won't tolerate. It also symbolizes poverty in its most painful form. Desperate parents trying to create joy from almost nothing. Today's parents would face judgment, even accusations of neglect, for serving this to their children. Yet for Depression-era children, that sugar sandwich was a moment of genuine happiness in an otherwise joyless time. The sweetness wasn't just taste, it was love, creativity, and hope manifested in the only way possible. Sugar sandwiches show us how sweetness becomes emotional comfort when nothing else is available, and how our judgment of past foods reflects our present privileges. Food 10. Vinegar pie. When lemons became a luxury item that most families couldn't afford, housewives discovered that vinegar could create a similar tartness in pies. Vinegar pie sounds horrifying to modern ears, but during the Depression, it was an acceptable substitute for the more traditional lemon chess pie. The filling combined vinegar with sugar, eggs when available, or cornstarch when not, butter or lard, and a small amount of flour to thicken it. The tartness of the vinegar balanced the sweetness, creating a surprisingly palatable dessert. The key was using good quality vinegar. Apple cider vinegar worked best, and not using too much. This pie disappeared because vinegar carries associations with cleaning and preservation, not dessert. Once citrus became affordable again, nobody wanted to admit they'd eaten vinegar pie. It was too closely associated with making do, with accepting substitutes instead of the real thing. Chemically, acetic acid in vinegar functions similarly to citric acid in lemons. Both provide tartness and help set the filling. The science was sound, but the psychology wasn't. We want desserts to feel indulgent and special, not practical and substitutional. Vinegar pie teaches us that culinary acceptability is as much about perception and context as it is about actual flavor, and that some substitutions feel like defeat rather than innovation. Food 11. Fried bologna. Bologna was one of the cheapest meats available during the Depression, made from scraps and fillers that wealthier consumers rejected. Families stretched their food budgets by frying thick slices of bologna until the edges curled up and the centers puffed slightly. The frying process caramelized the sugars in the bologna and crisped the fat, creating a texture and flavor more interesting than cold bologna from the package. Families served it with eggs for breakfast, between bread for sandwiches, or alongside potatoes for dinner. It was filling, required minimal cooking skill, and lasted well without refrigeration. Fried bologna disappeared from mainstream American tables because it became associated with poverty, trailer parks, and lower socioeconomic classes. As Americans' incomes rose, they wanted real meats like steak, pork chops, and chicken breast, not processed mystery meat made from scraps. Interestingly, fried bologna has persisted in certain regional cuisines, particularly in Appalachia and parts of the South, where it's embraced as comfort food rather than poverty food. The context changes everything. When chosen deliberately rather than forced by necessity, it becomes authentic rather than shameful. Fried bologna reminds us that class stigma attaches to foods as strongly as flavors do, and that the same dish can be comfort food in one community and an embarrassment in another. Food 12. Spaghetti with ketchup. When tomato sauce, even canned tomato sauce, became too expensive, families turned to an even cheaper substitute: ketchup. Boiled spaghetti was drained and mixed with ketchup, maybe a little margarine if available, and served as a complete meal. The sweetness of the ketchup was wrong, the texture was wrong, and the flavor profile was nothing like authentic Italian pasta. But it was red, it was warm, it filled you up, and most importantly, it was affordable. A single bottle of ketchup could sauce multiple meals for a large family. This dish disappeared because it represents culinary ignorance and desperation in equal measure. As Italian-American cuisine became mainstream and proper tomato sauce became affordable, spaghetti with ketchup became a source of shame, a marker of families who didn't know better or couldn't afford better. Today, suggesting that someone eats spaghetti with ketchup is an insult, implying they're unsophisticated or poor. College students living on ramen might be forgiven, but adults making this choice are judged harshly. Spaghetti with ketchup shows us how cuisine becomes a class marker, and how quickly we forget that our grandparents' bad taste was actually survival, not choice. Food 13. Bread and milk. This was perhaps the simplest depression meal: torn pieces of stale bread placed in a bowl, covered with milk, and sprinkled with a little sugar if available. It was served cold or barely warmed, and eaten with a spoon like cereal. Bread and milk used up bread that was going stale before it became inedible, and a small amount of milk could soften enough bread to fill several stomachs. The texture was mushy and unappetizing by modern standards, but it was gentle on stomachs weakened by hunger and required no cooking fuel. This meal disappeared because it looks and sounds like animal feed, like something you'd give to livestock rather than humans. The visual alone, soggy bread floating in milk, is deeply unappealing to people raised with abundant food choices. Nutritionally, bread and milk actually provided a reasonable balance of carbohydrates, protein, and calcium. For families with dairy cows or access to cheap milk, it was an efficient way to combine two staples into something filling. Bread and milk reminds us that hunger changes what looks appetizing, and that texture matters enormously when we have the luxury of being particular about our food. Food 14. Meatless loaf. When meat was unaffordable, families still craved the experience of a hearty main dish at the center of the table. Meatless loaf filled that role, made from whatever was available: lentils, rice, oats, nuts if the family had them, eggs when possible, and vegetables. The mixture was bound together with breadcrumbs or crackers, seasoned with whatever spices were on hand, and baked in a loaf pan to mimic the appearance of meatloaf. It was sliced and served with gravy made from flour and water or drippings saved from rare occasions when meat was available. This dish disappeared because it was an obvious fake, a stand-in that fooled nobody. Once meat became affordable again, families wanted the real thing: actual beef or pork with fat and flavor, not compressed vegetables pretending to be something they weren't. Ironically, modern vegetarian and vegan movements have created similar dishes, but they're marketed as conscious ethical choices rather than poverty food. A lentil loaf in 2025 is trendy and health conscious. In 1933, it was admitting you couldn't afford real meat. Meatless loaf teaches us that intention matters enormously in how we perceive food. The same ingredients can be virtuous or shameful depending on whether you chose them or were forced into them. Food 15. Lard sandwiches. When even margarine was too expensive, some families made sandwiches using lard, pure rendered pork fat spread on bread like butter. Sometimes they added salt or a sprinkle of sugar. That was the entire sandwich. Lard provided necessary calories and fat in a diet otherwise lacking in both. It had a mild pork flavor and a creamy texture when spread at room temperature. For children working on farms or walking miles to school, the caloric density of lard sandwiches provided fuel for physical labor. This sandwich disappeared because eating pure fat on bread seems barbaric by modern nutritional standards. The health consciousness that emerged in the late 20th century demonized saturated fats, and lard became associated with heart disease and poor health outcomes. Additionally, lard sandwiches represented the absolute bottom. If you were eating lard on bread, you had nothing else. It was admission of extreme poverty that nobody wanted to remember or claim. Interestingly, lard has made a minor comeback in high-end cooking and traditional foodways, valued for its flavor and cooking properties. But nobody's making lard sandwiches again. Some foods are too closely tied to suffering to be reclaimed. Lard sandwiches remind us that fat was once precious, that caloric density was survival, and that our nutritional fears reflect our abundance. Food 16. Cream chipped beef on toast. Known universally by its military nickname, SOS. Shit on a shingle. This dish consisted of dried beef that was reconstituted and cooked in a flour-thickened milk gravy, then served over toast. It was a military staple that found its way into Depression-era civilian kitchens. Dried beef was affordable because it kept forever without refrigeration. The gravy stretched the meat. A small amount of beef could feed many people when extended with flour and milk. The toast provided bulk and soaked up the gravy. This dish faded after the Depression and World War II because it was associated with military deprivation and canteen food. The dried beef was excessively salty, the gravy was often lumpy, and the overall appearance was genuinely unappetizing. Veterans who ate it out of necessity didn't want to see it at home. The crude military nickname didn't help. Calling your food shit on a shingle reveals how soldiers actually felt about it. It was sustenance, not enjoyment, and nobody serves food they openly mock once they have better options. Cream chipped beef on toast reminds us that military food culture influences civilian eating during hard times, and that some foods are too connected to trauma to survive in peacetime. Food 17. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich. This combination sounds horrifying to modern palates, but during the Depression, it made sense. Both peanut butter and mayonnaise were affordable, shelf-stable proteins that didn't require refrigeration. Combined on white bread, they provided fat and protein in a filling sandwich. The texture was creamy and rich. Though the flavor combination was unusual, the tang of mayonnaise against the sweetness of peanut butter. Some families added lettuce if they had it. It was most popular in the South, where mayonnaise was a dietary staple. This sandwich disappeared because it seems wrong. Peanut butter belongs with jelly or honey, not mayonnaise. The combination violates our learned food pairing rules. Once families could afford standard sandwich fillings like ham or cheese, the peanut butter and mayonnaise combo was abandoned. The sandwich occasionally appears in internet discussions of weird Depression foods, always with disgust and disbelief. Modern taste testers usually hate it, though some Southerners defend it as a regional peculiarity rather than a poverty food. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches show us that food pairing rules are learned, not innate, and that we forget the logic of combinations once we no longer need them. Food 18. Liver mush. Liver mush was a Southern Appalachian dish made from pork liver, cornmeal, and spices, cooked together into a mush, poured into loaf pans, and allowed to set. Once solid, it was sliced and fried until crispy on the outside. Liver was one of the cheapest cuts available because most Americans disliked organ meats. The cornmeal stretched the liver further and provided bulk. Fried liver mush was served for breakfast with eggs, or as a sandwich filling, or alongside greens for dinner. This dish largely disappeared from mainstream American tables because organ meats fell completely out of favor after World War II. As Americans could afford muscle meats, they rejected variety meats as poverty food or animal feed. Liver mush survives in certain parts of North Carolina where it's maintained as regional identity food, but it's increasingly rare even there. Young generations find the idea of eating liver repulsive, and the mush descriptor doesn't help. Liver mush reminds us that we've lost the nose-to-tail eating philosophy that was once necessary, and that our modern pickiness about meat cuts reflects our wealth. Food 19. Tomato soup cake. This was a spice cake made with condensed tomato soup as the liquid base instead of milk or water. The soup provided moisture, acidity, and a subtle vegetable sweetness that works surprisingly well in cake. The tomato flavor wasn't noticeable in the finished cake, it simply provided structure and moisture while the spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves dominated. Families often made this without frosting or with a simple powdered sugar glaze. Tomato soup cake disappeared because it seems bizarre and unappetizing to use soup in dessert. Even though it tasted good, the concept violates our categories of savory and sweet. Once families could afford proper baking ingredients, why would anyone choose to bake with soup? Campbell's Soup Company actively promoted this recipe during the Depression, and it occasionally resurfaces as a curiosity. Some people are surprised to find they actually like it, but few make it regularly. Tomato soup cake teaches us that ingredient categories are flexible in times of necessity, and that psychological barriers matter more than actual flavor when we have abundant choices. Food 20. Wilted lettuce salad. This wasn't a salad of fresh, crisp lettuce, it was lettuce deliberately wilted by pouring hot bacon grease and vinegar over it. The heat softened the lettuce and created a warm, tangy dish that stretched a small amount of bacon into a full side dish. The bacon grease provided crucial fat and flavor, while the vinegar added brightness. Families often added sliced onions, hard-boiled eggs if available, and a pinch of sugar to balance the acid. It was served immediately while still warm. Wilted lettuce salad faded because Americans developed a preference for cold, crisp salads with creamy dressings. The appearance of wilted lettuce seemed spoiled or rotten rather than intentionally prepared. The hot bacon grease also fell out of favor during the low-fat diet craze. This dish survives in Pennsylvania Dutch communities and parts of the South as traditional fare, but it's increasingly rare. Modern diners associate wilted vegetables with overcooking or age, not culinary technique. Wilted lettuce salad shows us that texture preferences are culturally learned, and that the same preparation technique can seem sophisticated in one era and poverty-stricken in another. Food 21. Corn mush. Polenta. Cornmeal cooked slowly with water or milk until thick, then served hot with butter and sugar, or cold and sliced to be fried later. This was essentially polenta, though Depression-era Americans didn't use that Italian name. Cornmeal was one of the cheapest grains available, and it expanded significantly when cooked. A small amount could fill many bowls. It could be served sweet for breakfast or savory for dinner, making it incredibly versatile. Plain corn mush largely disappeared as a staple because it was considered boring and poverty food. However, polenta experienced a renaissance in the 1980s and 1990s when Italian cuisine became fashionable. The same dish that was shameful as corn mush became sophisticated as polenta. This represents one of the most dramatic transformations in American food history. The same ingredient prepared the same way, but renamed and recontextualized, went from poverty food to restaurant menu staple. Corn mush teaches us that naming and cultural framing matter enormously, and that some Depression foods could be rescued simply by changing what we call them and how we present them. Food 22. Fried green tomatoes. While fried green tomatoes have remained popular in the South, during the Depression they spread nationwide as a way to use unripe tomatoes before the first frost destroyed them. Nothing could be wasted, not even tomatoes that hadn't ripened yet. The firm texture of green tomatoes held up well to frying. They were sliced, dredged in cornmeal or flour, and fried in whatever fat was available. The result was tangy, slightly acidic, and crispy, a way to salvage produce that would otherwise be lost. This practice faded in most of the country because once food security improved, people preferred to wait for tomatoes to ripen properly. The labor of frying and the expense of cooking fat seemed unnecessary when ripe produce was available. Fried green tomatoes survived in the South, where they transitioned from necessity food to regional identity food, especially after the 1991 movie popularized them nationally. But they're now a choice, not a desperate attempt to save food from freezing. Fried green tomatoes remind us that some Depression foods survived by becoming regional specialties, and that the South maintained poverty foods as cultural identity when other regions abandoned them. Food 23. Mulligan stew. Mulligan stew was the hobo's meal, cooked communally in camps along railroad lines. Every person contributed whatever they had: a potato, an onion, a can of vegetables, a handful of rice, all thrown together in a large pot over an open fire. There was no recipe because there couldn't be. The stew depended entirely on what people contributed that day. It might be thick and hearty or thin and watery. The point was sharing and community, not cuisine. Mulligan stew disappeared when the hobo culture of the Depression era ended. As the economy recovered and freight rail security improved, the transient camps dissolved. The stew was tied to a specific moment of mass homelessness that Americans wanted to forget. The concept survives in communal cooking events and stone soup traditions, but the original context, desperate men sharing scraps to survive, is gone. Modern versions are planned, organized, and voluntary, nothing like the necessity that created Mulligan stew. Mulligan stew teaches us that some foods exist only in specific social contexts, and that communal poverty creates different food cultures than individual poverty. Food 24. Navy bean soup. Navy beans were a Depression staple, cheap, dried, shelf-stable, protein-rich, and able to feed many people from a small quantity. Navy bean soup was cooked slowly with a ham bone if available, or just water and salt if not. The soup was thick, filling, and could be stretched by adding more water. Families ate it for days, reheating and adding to the pot as needed. A single pot of bean soup could be the week's meals for a large family. Navy bean soup hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's much less common because dried beans require soaking, long cooking times, and planning ahead luxuries modern Americans with instant food access don't feel they have. Canned soup replaced homemade versions. The soup also carries Depression associations that make it seem like settling for less. When we make bean soup now, we add bacon, ham, vegetables, herbs, we make it special. Depression bean soup was beans and water, maybe a bone for flavor. Navy bean soup reminds us that the same dish can be poverty food or comfort food depending on how we make it, and that we measure progress partly by what we add to basic recipes. Food 25. Bread pudding from stale bread. Bread pudding existed before the Depression, but during that era it became essential, a way to use rock-hard stale bread that would otherwise be thrown away. Nothing could be wasted, not even bread too hard to chew. The stale bread was soaked in a mixture of milk when available, eggs if possible, sugar, and spices like cinnamon. Baked slowly, it transformed into a custardy dessert that felt indulgent despite using scraps and leftovers. Bread pudding survived the Depression era better than most foods on this list because it could be elevated. As ingredients became available, people added raisins, vanilla, cream, whiskey sauce, transforming it from poverty food to legitimate dessert. However, the plain versions, bread, water, and a little sugar, disappeared completely. Nobody wants bread pudding that tastes like desperation. The modern versions are rich, decadent, and sophisticated, barely recognizable as descendants of Depression bread pudding. Bread pudding teaches us that some Depression foods survived by evolving and upgrading, and that we rescue dishes from poverty associations by making them luxurious. We've journeyed through 25 foods that once filled American tables during the nation's darkest economic hours. From water pie to bread pudding, from dandelion salad to mulligan stew, each dish tells a story of resilience, creativity, and survival against impossible odds. What's remarkable isn't just that our grandparents and great-grandparents ate these foods, it's that they managed to find sweetness, community, and even joy in meals made from almost nothing. Water pie wasn't just chemistry and calories. It was an act of love, a way to give children dessert when there was no money for sugar or eggs. Hoover stew wasn't just random ingredients in a pot. It was political commentary, a way to maintain dignity and humor in the face of despair. These foods disappeared not because they tasted terrible, some were actually quite good, but because they carried unbearable emotional weight. They reminded people of hunger, of helplessness, of watching their children go to bed with empty stomachs. Once prosperity returned, Americans wanted to forget these meals as quickly as possible. The foods became symbols of a trauma the nation collectively chose not to remember. But there's danger in forgetting completely. These recipes represent problem-solving, resourcefulness, and adaptability that we've largely lost. We've forgotten how to make something from nothing, how to eat seasonally and locally by necessity, how to waste nothing. Our modern abundance is wonderful, but it's also made us fragile, dependent on complex supply chains, and vulnerable to disruption. Perhaps most importantly, these Depression-era foods remind us that food is never just food. Every meal carries meaning, memory, and emotion. We don't just eat calories and nutrients, we eat stories, identity, and history. The shame our grandparents felt about water pie was as real as the hunger it satisfied. The pride we feel in artisanal sourdough is as real as the nutrition it provides. As we face new challenges, climate change, economic instability, supply chain disruptions, maybe there's wisdom in remembering how previous generations adapted their tables to their circumstances. Not to romanticize poverty or pretend hardship was noble, but to recognize that humans are remarkably creative when necessary. and that survival sometimes requires letting go of what we think food should be. The next time you throw away stale bread, leave dandelions to be poisoned with herbicide, or spend $20 on a single restaurant meal, remember that your grandparents would have made a week's worth of dinners from what we casually discard. Remember that abundance is recent, fragile, and precious. If you enjoyed this journey through Depression-era cuisine and learned something about American history, resilience, and the power of food to tell our stories, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with family members who might remember these dishes, or with anyone interested in history, cooking, or human adaptability. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten foods, historical cuisine, and the stories our meals tell about who we are. And drop a comment. Did your family have Depression-era recipes that got passed down? What forgotten foods do you think deserve to be remembered? Let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for watching, and remember, every meal is a story worth telling.